The stone walls of Čachtice Castle stand in silence. But silence does not mean peace. For those who linger too long within its ruins, it seems as though echoes still ripple through the air, echoes of screams that once shook the corridors, echoes of footsteps in chambers where no one lives anymore. The castle looms above the Slovakian countryside like a skeletal memory, its towers crumbling but its presence undiminished. Even now, centuries later, local villagers avoid the place after dusk. They say that in winter, when the wind cuts like a knife across the hills, you can still hear faint cries carried on the night air. Legends cling to these walls like ivy. Stand in what remains of the northern tower, they say, and you can almost smell it. The metallic tang of iron mingled with the sweet, rotten perfume of old decay. It is not merely imagination. It is memory, etched into stone, into soil, into the collective fear of generations who grew up in the shadow of this fortress. And at the center of these stories is a name that still inspires shivers across Europe. Elizabeth Báthory, the so-called Blood Countess. The year is 1610. In the damp bowels of Čachtice, candles sputter in the cold air, throwing faint light across walls blackened with soot and stain. A woman sits in a bath that is not filled with water. The liquid is thicker, darker, steaming faintly in the dungeon chill. Her pale skin, once renowned across Hungary for its beauty, now shows the first betrayals of age, wrinkles tracing the corners of her eyes, faint lines pressing into her lips. And yet, as she runs her hands through the crimson bath, she believes, with the certainty of faith, that youth and beauty are still within her grasp. The liquid comes at a cost. A girl lies nearby, motionless, her body emptied of life. She was 16, barely more than a child. Her only crime, a clumsy hand that tugged too hard at the noblewoman's hair while dressing it. For that mistake, she has been silenced forever, her blood now serving a purpose she could never have imagined. It is here, at this moment, that the legend of Elizabeth Báthory becomes something larger than history, something closer to myth. How could a woman of noble birth, educated in philosophy, fluent in languages, raised in the corridors of European power, descend into such depths of cruelty? Was she merely a monster by nature, or the inevitable product of a world that exalted bloodlines while ignoring the value of human life? To answer that question, we must go back, not just to her crimes, but to her beginnings. For monsters are rarely born. They are shaped, molded by the circumstances of their time. Elizabeth was not a phantom pulled from nightmare. She was a daughter, a wife, a widow, a noble woman, living in an age when the boundary between civilization and savagery was perilously thin. Before we descend into the chambers of her horrors, it is worth pausing at the threshold of history itself. Castles like Čachtice were more than stone and mortar. They were theaters of power, where life and death were staged daily for the benefit of those who ruled. The peasants who lived in the valleys below offered their sweat, their grain, and sometimes their lives to maintain the wealth of those within these walls. In this world, cruelty was not an aberration. It was governance. It was a tool, sharpened by fear. And so, as we begin the tale of Elizabeth Báthory, let us not only ask who she was, but also what world allowed her to thrive. Because sometimes the darkness we inherit explains more than the darkness we create. Elizabeth Báthory was born in 1560 into one of the most powerful families in Hungary. To be a Báthory was to inherit both glory and shadow. The family name carried weight across Eastern Europe. Warriors who had battled the Ottoman Turks, princes who had ruled Transylvania, nobles who had shaped alliances and toppled enemies. Their bloodline was celebrated as dragon slayers and defenders of Christendom, men and women whose decisions bent the fate of kingdoms. Yet behind the grandeur lay a darker inheritance. The Báthory tree, impressive in its reach, was twisted in its roots. Nary, centuries of intermarriage within the noble class concentrated wealth and influence, but also the fragility of mind. madness, paranoia, and violent temper ran through their veins as surely as titles and estates. Elizabeth's uncle, Istvan, was infamous for his rages, lashing out at servants and prisoners with equal fury. Her cousin, Gabor, would later rule Transylvania in ways so erratic that his reign became a byword for cruelty and suspicion. And then there was her aunt, Clara, whispered about in hushed tones as a woman who dabbled in the dark arts, mixing herbs, muttering incantations, and instructing young Elizabeth in potions that blurred the line between healing and witchcraft. Titori, Hungary in the 16th century was a land balanced on the knife edge of history. To the west, the Habsburg Empire pressed its authority. To the south, the Ottoman Turks advanced with relentless force. Wars swept across the plains, leaving ashes where villages once stood. Nobles like the Báthorys were not merely lords of land, but bulwarks of survival. Commanders expected to supply soldiers, fortresses, and tribute. In such a world, power was both privilege and necessity. To be born a Báthory was to carry not just wealth, but a burden, to dominate or to be devoured. Elizabeth grew up surrounded by these contradictions. She was a child of privilege, her skin pale, her dark eyes sharp, her tutors teaching her to read and write in Latin, German, Hungarian, and Greek. Few women of her era could boast such education. She could debate philosophy, discuss theology, and correspond with nobles across Europe. In the candlelit halls of her family's estates, she was prepared for rule, not merely as a consort, but as a force in her own right. But privilege in that age was steeped in blood. To be noble meant to command life and death over those beneath you. Human worth was measured not by dignity, but by rank, and the peasants who toiled outside castle walls were viewed less as neighbors than as resources to be spent. From her earliest years, Elizabeth was immersed in a culture where cruelty was not extraordinary. It was expected. Public punishments, executions, and torture were woven into the fabric of authority. Imagine the impressionable child walking through the great halls, hearing the clash of steel as soldiers practiced, smelling the tang of blood after an execution, listening to her elders debate strategy not in terms of lives but in numbers, as if men were coins to be spent in war. She learned Latin conjugations in the morning, and in the afternoon she might watch a thief have his hands severed for stealing bread. To her, intellect and violence were not contradictions. They were twin pillars of noble life. Elizabeth's world, therefore, was not one of innocence corrupted, but of cruelty normalized. To survive in it, one had to learn early. Compassion was weakness, and fear was the surest weapon of rule. In this crucible, the young noble girl absorbed lessons that would echo years later in the dungeons of Čachtice Castle. Elizabeth's childhood was marked by contrasts so sharp they could cut. By day she sat in candlelit chambers, surrounded by tutors who praised her brilliance. She learned languages with ease: Hungarian, Latin, German, and Greek, her young mind absorbing words and philosophies far beyond her years. She read about the grandeur of Rome, the wisdom of Aristotle, the strategies of Machiavelli, and she grew up believing she was destined to command rather than to obey. Few girls in Europe possessed such an education. She was not being groomed to be a mere ornament of court, but a woman capable of holding power. Yet when night fell, or even sometimes in the stark light of morning, Elizabeth was taught other lessons, lessons that no book recorded, but that her family understood well. The Báthory estate was not only a place of refinement, but of fear. Her aunt Clara, notorious for her strange practices, whispered to the young girl about herbs and charms, showing her powders that could kill in silence and salves that could numb pain. Whether these were the healing traditions of folk medicine or the shadows of witchcraft, Elizabeth learned that the line between remedy and poison was as thin as a blade of grass. The most vivid lessons, however, came not from books or herbs, but from blood. At the age of 11, Elizabeth witnessed her first execution. A peasant accused of stealing grain, perhaps desperate after a poor harvest, was brought before her father. For nobles like the Báthorys, justice was not blind, it was performance. The sentence was death, but not the swift mercy of a sword. Instead, the man was stripped, bound, and dragged into the courtyard. From the warm chambers above, Elizabeth watched. The winter winds cut through the air like knives, and the condemned was left exposed, his cries echoing against the stone. His skin turned first red, then blue, then an unnatural black as the hours dragged on. Guards laughed. Courtiers whispered. But Elizabeth did not look away. Not even when his fingers cracked and fell away in brittle shards from frostbite. Later in life, she told her servants that this was the moment she first understood power. Not the power of wealth, nor of armies, nor of titles, but the raw, intoxicating truth that life could be ended slowly, deliberately, while the one who held authority watched the light fade from a victim's eyes. To her, cruelty was not savagery. It was control. There were other moments, too. Rumors whisper that she watched a horse's belly split open and a thief sewn inside, left to suffocate beneath the animal's thrashing. She saw lashes that tore flesh, branding irons pressed to skin, and men broken on the wheel until bones jutted through like shards of ivory. These spectacles were lessons wrapped in blood, lessons that taught her not only what fear could do, but how fear itself could rule. And so, while Elizabeth was praised for her beauty, for her intelligence, and for her noble poise, there was another education unfolding, an education in shadows. Every execution became a lecture, every scream a textbook, every corpse a reminder that in her world, life was fragile, and only those who commanded death truly held power. It is here, in these corridors of her youth, that we glimpse the beginning of the Blood Countess. Not yet in deed, but in thought. A girl who saw cruelty not as tragedy, but as inheritance. A child who began to equate fear with authority. And a young woman who would one day use these lessons not merely to rule, but to destroy. At the age of 15, Elizabeth's life shifted from the gilded halls of her family estate to a new chapter: marriage. Like all noble unions of the time, hers was less about love than about power. In 1575, she was wed to Ferenc Nadasti, a powerful military commander whose reputation already stretched across Hungary. History remembers him by a title as dark as the armor he wore: the Black Knight of Hungary. The ceremony was a spectacle befitting two dynasties. Hundreds of guests filled the Báthory estates, feasting beneath banners of crimson and gold. Elizabeth received a castle as part of her dowry, Čachtice, or Čachtice as we know it today, the fortress that would later become infamous for her crimes. But what no one could have foreseen on that wedding day was that the marriage itself would serve as an apprenticeship in cruelty. Ferenc Nadasti was not the gentle sort. He was forged in war. For decades, Hungary had been a battleground between Christian Europe and the advancing Ottoman Empire. Ferenc had risen to prominence, leading soldiers in campaigns marked by their ferocity. To his men, he was a commander both respected and feared, one who understood that survival on the frontier required a stomach for brutality. His enemies called him merciless. His allies called him effective. To Elizabeth, he was both husband and mentor. While Ferenc was often away at war, when he returned, he carried with him stories of interrogation and punishment. But he brought back more than tales. He demonstrated methods: how to break a body without killing it, how to prolong pain, how to extract obedience through fear. The young countess, already fascinated by the power she had witnessed in childhood, now had a partner who not only condoned her darker curiosities, but encouraged them. Their honeymoon, if such a word can be applied, was spent not in romance but in shadowed chambers below the castle. Servants who displeased them became objects of experiment. A girl who spilled wine might find herself burned with irons. A boy who spoke disrespectfully might endure needles driven beneath his nails. These punishments were not swift executions meant to uphold justice. They were rehearsals of pain, carefully measured to satisfy the couple's shared appetite for control. For Elizabeth, these lessons were revelations. She discovered that the human body could endure far more than she had imagined. She learned precision, where to cut so the victim bled but did not die, how to inflict terror without granting the release of death. And with each experiment, she felt a thrill that no silks, no jewels, no courtly intrigues could provide. Pain itself became her intoxicant, but there was more than cruelty in their partnership. Ferenc, despite his brutality, was also a man of ambition. Together, he and Elizabeth built a reputation as a power couple of their age. While he waged war against the Ottomans, she managed estates, corresponded with nobles, and commanded respect in courtly circles. In public, she was poised, educated, admired for her wit and beauty. In private, she and Ferenc shared secrets darker than any court would dare whisper. Then, in 1604, Ferenc died. The official cause was illness, though rumors whispered that even the Black Knight had grown uneasy with the depths of Elizabeth's cruelty, and perhaps fate itself intervened. Regardless of the truth, his death marked a turning point. At 44, Elizabeth was no longer merely a noblewoman's wife. She was a widow with vast estates, immense wealth, and, most importantly, absolute authority over hundreds of lives. For the first time in her life, there was no husband, no father, no overseer above her. She answered to no one but herself. And with that freedom came a dangerous revelation. She could now indulge her darkest impulses without restraint. The Countess was about to step fully into the role history would remember her for, not merely a participant in cruelty, but its architect. When Ferenc Nadasdy, the Black Knight of Hungary, died in 1604, Elizabeth Báthory stood at a crossroads. She was 44 years old, wealthy beyond measure, and mistress of lands that stretched for miles across the Hungarian countryside. With Ferenc gone, her world did not shrink, it expanded. No longer tethered to a husband's command, Elizabeth had complete autonomy. The estates, the peasants, the servants, the soldiers, they were hers to command. This was not a small inheritance. The Nadasdy and Báthory families had long been pillars of Eastern European nobility, and the union of their names made Elizabeth one of the most powerful women of her time. She had wealth, castles, and the unquestioned authority to govern hundreds of lives. But with great autonomy came something else, the unfiltered presence of her own obsessions. Aging was becoming her silent enemy. For decades, Elizabeth had been admired for her pale skin, her striking dark hair, her commanding presence. But in her mid-40s, time began to betray her. Lines crept along her forehead. Spots darkened her hands. The mirror, once her companion, now whispered a cruel truth. Beauty fades, even for a countess. It was during this period that the story of her blood discovery first took root. A young maid, tasked with brushing Elizabeth's long hair, pulled too harshly at a knot. The countess, enraged, struck the girl across the face. Her jeweled ring sliced open the servant's cheek, and drops of blood spattered across Elizabeth's hand. She wiped them away impatiently, but then paused. Later, as she studied her skin in the mirror, she thought she saw it. The place where the blood had touched appeared smoother, younger, untouched by age. Was it real? Or was it the desperate illusion of a woman unwilling to accept mortality? To Elizabeth, it didn't matter. Belief was enough. In that moment, a seed was planted, one that would grow into madness. From then on, the Countess's fascination with blood intensified. She began with small experiments. A pinprick here, a shallow cut there. She collected the crimson liquid in bowls and smeared it across her skin, watching her reflection for changes. Servants whispered of her long hours before the mirror, studying her face for signs that youth could be coaxed back from the past. But belief, once born, has a way of demanding proof. Elizabeth became convinced that blood was not just a symbol of youth, but the very essence of it. The small amounts she gathered were no longer enough. She craved more blood, more victims, more certainty that she could defy the natural order. The timing of her obsession was not accidental. Across Renaissance Europe, alchemists and physicians searched for elixirs of life. Tales of secret tonics, magical springs, and powders of rejuvenation were whispered in courts from Prague to Florence. Even learned men like Paracelsus had written of the body's hidden energies and the possibility of prolonging life. For Elizabeth, raised in a family that mingled nobility with superstition, the idea that youth could be preserved through ritual was not unthinkable. It was plausible. But where others pursued philosophy and alchemy, Elizabeth pursued flesh and blood. She had the wealth to buy rare perfumes, the influence to import exotic oils, the means to secure the finest cosmetics Europe could offer. Yet none of it satisfied her. Only one substance seemed potent enough to fight the slow march of age. And for that substance, someone always had to suffer. What began as accident soon hardened into obsession. And with no husband to restrain her, no authority to check her impulses, the Countess of Čachtice was about to cross the line from cruelty into something far more monstrous. The first death done for blood was not planned as ritual. It emerged almost by accident. After the incident with the maid's cut cheek, Elizabeth became convinced that blood contained power, a hidden vitality that might be transferred to her own body. She began with small trials, masking her intentions as punishment. A careless servant might be pricked with a needle, her blood collected in a silver bowl. Elizabeth dabbed it onto her skin like rouge, then studied her reflection in obsessive silence, searching for any trace of change. At first, it was never enough. Her handmaiden whispered that the Countess spent hours with mirrors, sometimes holding them so close her breath fogged the glass. She was no longer content with jewels, silks, or feasts. Her mind fixated on the most fragile of treasures, her own beauty. And as her obsession grew, her cruelty darkened. Elizabeth began to experiment in earnest. Some punishments that once would have ended in bruises now ended in death. A servant girl accused of laziness was beaten until her lifeblood filled the floor. Another, accused of stealing bread, was cut deliberately in ways that allowed Elizabeth to collect the blood more efficiently. Always, the victims were young, fair, and healthy. To Elizabeth, their vitality was something she could steal, something she could drink into her skin. In this, she was not entirely alone. Across Europe, whispers of blood's power had long existed. Ancient physicians had believed that blood carried the essence of life. Medieval doctors practiced bloodletting to balance humors. Folk healers told tales of maidens' blood-curing ailments, of the young reviving the old. Elizabeth, with her upbringing steeped in superstition and her aunt's half-magical remedies, found herself stepping into a tradition that blurred science and sorcery. But unlike philosophers and alchemists, she did not write theories. She spilled bodies. The killings began slowly. Months might pass between deaths, each wrapped in excuses. A girl who vanished in the night, a servant dismissed without warning. The peasants rarely questioned. In a world where poverty drove people to wander, disappearances were not unusual. And even if suspicions stirred, who among the common folk would dare accuse a Báthory? Elizabeth's rituals grew bolder. She ordered girls stripped and bound in chambers where thick stone walls smothered their screams. She demanded fresh, warm blood, convinced that only the moment of death preserved youth's strength. She bathed her hands, her face, and eventually her entire body in crimson, whispering prayers that blended Christian words with the darker invocations taught by her Aunt Clara. It is easy, centuries later, to imagine Elizabeth as a creature of Gothic fantasy, a vampire countess born of nightmare. But in reality, she was still a woman of her age. She entertained guests at feasts, exchanged letters with noble relatives, and played the role of respectable widow. By day, she managed estates and spoke of faith. By night, she descended into chambers of horror. Her public mask and private depravity became inseparable, two sides of a life that fed upon itself. And yet, at this stage, her murders remained hidden, cloaked by silence, protected by her name. Few dared to question when a peasant girl vanished. In the economy of the nobility, lives of the poor were expendable. Elizabeth's victims were not merely casualties of her obsession, they were casualties of a system that allowed nobles to rule unchecked. What began as an accident, a single spatter of blood on a jeweled hand, was now a habit. Soon it would become a system. Elizabeth had crossed the line between cruelty and murder, and there was no path back. As Elizabeth's obsession deepened, she realized she could not act alone. To kill once or twice might pass unnoticed, but to feed her growing hunger for blood, she needed structure, an inner circle that would obey without hesitation. And so, around her, she gathered accomplices who became extensions of her cruelty. There was Čachtice, an older woman with the reputation of a village witch. She whispered advice, prepared charms, and lent Elizabeth the confidence of superstition, feeding her belief that blood was more than flesh. It was a vessel of power. János Ujvari, a dwarf who served as her bodyguard, became her executioner, wielding the instruments of torture with pitiless precision. Ilona Yo, once a servant girl herself, now scouted and procured victims, luring them with promises of work in the castle. And Catalin Bennick, a washerwoman, disposed of the bodies when the rituals were complete, scrubbing away stains that could not truly be erased. Together, they formed what can only be described as a system of murder. Their roles were divided with grim efficiency, one to lure, one to restrain, one to torture, one to cleanse. Victims were chosen carefully, always young, always female, always radiant with the vitality Elizabeth craved. Some were peasants drawn in by false promises. Others were castle servants, punished for trivial mistakes. The methods varied with Elizabeth's mood. Some girls were beaten with clubs until their bones cracked. Others were seared with hot irons, their screams echoing in stone chambers muffled by tapestries. Needles were thrust under fingernails, knives traced patterns into flesh, blood drained slowly into basins beneath their suspended bodies. Elizabeth believed that terror itself made the blood more potent, that the essence of life reached its peak in the moment of agony. The castle became a place of unspoken dread. Servants moved in silence, never knowing whether a clumsy step or a misplaced glance might seal their fate. Villagers whispered but did not act. To accuse a noblewoman was to court ruin. Even those who suspected something dark within Čachtice's walls dared not speak. In feudal Hungary, the lives of peasants were not counted. They were weighed and found easily expendable. What made this machinery of death so effective was not only Elizabeth's will, but the obedience of her accomplices. Some historians suggest they were motivated by fear, too terrified to defy their mistress. Others believe they shared in her cruelty, emboldened by the rare chance to wield power over the powerless. Whatever the truth, their silence and complicity allowed the killings to multiply. And multiply they did. Month by month, year by year, the rituals became more frequent. Elizabeth, once content with small experiments, now demanded rivers of blood. The dungeons filled with cries that never reached beyond the castle walls. The smell of death clung to the stones, masked by incense but never fully erased. This was no longer mere cruelty. It was industry. It was a machine, one fueled by the lives of the young and the desperate, sustained by fear, and directed by the hand of a countess who believed herself untouchable. Between 1604 and 1609, Elizabeth's rituals transformed from scattered punishments into systematic slaughter. What had begun as isolated incidents became routine. At first, perhaps one girl every few months would vanish, then one every few weeks. By the end, the killings were so frequent that the castle itself seemed to breathe death. Chambers that had once housed guests were converted into makeshift torture rooms, their walls covered with heavy drapes to muffle screams. Iron implements hung like surgical tools, knives and branding irons blackened by use. Stone floors, once scrubbed clean by terrified hands, bore stains that never faded. The air was choked with incense meant to mask the smell of burning flesh and rot, but the villagers below still caught whiffs of something foul when the wind turned. And yet, no official hand intervened. In the eyes of society, the lives being lost were expendable. Most victims were peasant girls, daughters of serfs who toiled in Elizabeth's lands. For their families, service in the castle was a chance at survival, sometimes even advancement. When the girls disappeared, explanations came easily. They had fled to another town, eloped with a young man, or died from illness. Few dared imagine, let alone accuse, the Countess herself. Local officials were not blind, but they were bound. Nobles like Elizabeth were nearly untouchable in the feudal hierarchy. To question her was to risk both livelihood and life. Bribes were offered, silence purchased. And in a world where the suffering of peasants was accepted as the natural order, their vanishing barely stirred a ripple. The truth was that cruelty was not unusual in noble households. Lords and ladies ruled with iron authority, punishments were harsh, and executions public. But Elizabeth crossed the line between punishment and indulgence. She did not kill to maintain discipline. She killed to feed an obsession. And this difference, though monstrous, was not easily visible to the outside world. Still, rumors spread. Mothers warned their daughters to avoid the castle at all costs. Farmhands whispered of screams carried down from the fortress on stormy nights. Stories circulated in taverns, where peasants spoke in hushed voices of the Countess who bathed in blood. Some dismissed it as superstition, others as slander. But to those who lived closest to the walls of Čachtice, the fear was real. Elizabeth herself seemed only emboldened by the silence. With each year, her killings grew bolder, more elaborate. She designed rituals in which girls were suspended from ceilings, their blood drained into basins below. She commanded her servants to strip victims bare, not only to humiliate them, but to ensure that not a drop of precious blood was wasted on fabric. She insisted that terror, prolonged over days, purified the blood and made it more effective. For nearly 5 years, this continued unchecked. The castle became a charnel house, its stones soaked with death, its silence guarded by complicity. Elizabeth's hunger had become routine, as regular as the changing of seasons. She had discovered the terrible truth of unchecked power, that when no one dares to stop you, there is no limit to how far you will go. By the end of the first decade of the 1600s, Elizabeth was no longer satisfied with the blood of peasant girls. She had killed so many that even she began to doubt their effectiveness. In her twisted reasoning, she convinced herself that the blood of commoners was weaker, tainted by their low birth and constant toil. If youth and vitality could truly be absorbed, then surely noble blood, pure, refined, touched by generations of privilege, would be more potent. And so she turned her gaze higher. At first, the shift was subtle. Elizabeth began inviting daughters of minor nobles to her castle under the guise of education. It was common practice for families of modest rank to send their girls to wealthier households, where they would learn etiquette, household management, and the arts expected of a lady. For many, an invitation from the Countess Báthory seemed an honor. Few suspected that behind her refined smile lay something closer to a wolf's grin. The first known noble victim was a distant cousin, Anna, just 16 years old. Her parents entrusted her to Elizabeth, believing she would receive refinement and protection. Letters soon arrived, polite notes filled with reports of her studies, written in her own style. But these letters were forgeries. Anna was already dead, tortured for days until her youth was drained in crimson bowls. Elizabeth herself had penned the letters, mimicking the girl's hand, weaving lies to delay suspicion. But deception could not last forever. When Anna failed to return home, her parents traveled to Čachtice. Elizabeth received them graciously, expressing concern, suggesting that perhaps their daughter had run away with a suitor. She even offered help in the search. But her mask slipped when Anna's mother noticed something chilling. The Countess wore her daughter's necklace, a family heirloom that Anna would never have parted with willingly. Whispers spread quickly. Noble families are not like peasants. They have voices that carry into courts, and their daughters cannot vanish without consequence. Rumors multiplied. Young women who entered Čachtice Castle often never returned. Invitations from Elizabeth began to be treated with dread, and some parents refused to send their daughters at all. Those who did agreed only on the condition of frequent letters or visits. The circle of suspicion began to tighten. What Elizabeth failed to see, or refused to see, was that her ambition had betrayed her. As long as she confined her cruelty to the peasantry, the world turned away. But the nobility guarded its own. A missing peasant was a tragedy whispered at the hearth. A missing noble daughter was a scandal that reached the ears of kings. Still, Elizabeth pressed forward. Her obsession had grown too deep to retreat. She believed she was fighting not merely time, but death itself, and that battle demanded more blood, always more. She told herself that noble victims were rarer, but stronger, and that their sacrifice was justified for her survival. In truth, she was already standing on the edge of her downfall. It would not be long before her crimes, once hidden by silence, became too loud to ignore. The rumors about missing noble daughters soon reached the highest ears. At court in Vienna and Bratislava, whispers of Countess Báthory's strange habits grew louder. The Hungarian king, Matthias II, had long carried a grievance against the Báthory family, not least because the crown owed them substantial debts. To move against Elizabeth was not only an act of justice, but also a chance to weaken her lineage and seize her vast estates. The king entrusted the matter to György Thurzó, the Palatine of Hungary, the highest-ranking noble after the king himself. Ironically, Thurzó was a relative of Elizabeth's late husband, and so could not be accused of acting purely out of malice. His reputation was one of method and caution, a man who valued evidence over rumor. If he could prove the Countess guilty, the verdict would be beyond dispute. Thurzó began quietly. He traveled through the countryside, meeting families whose daughters had vanished after entering Elizabeth's service. Their testimonies painted a chilling pattern. Forged letters, false reassurances, silence followed by absence. Mothers spoke of necklaces and garments recognized on other girls, jewels that once belonged to the missing. Some survivors, servants who had fled, spoke in trembling voices of chambers where girls were chained, beaten, and drained of blood while the Countess looked on. The investigation stretched for months. Thurzó interviewed dozens of witnesses, compiling testimonies that filled entire ledgers. Local officials confessed to having been bribed to remain silent. Priests whispered of sins too dark to name, but too consistent to ignore. Even among the nobility, murmurs of suspicion grew. Elizabeth's reputation, once gilded, was now stained beyond repair. But Thurzó understood the danger of moving too soon. Elizabeth was still a Báthory, protected by her name and by law. To accuse a noblewoman without irrefutable evidence risked scandal and civil unrest. He needed to catch her not just by rumor, but by deed red-handed, surrounded by undeniable proof. Meanwhile, Elizabeth continued as though untouchable. Her rituals did not cease. Perhaps she suspected nothing. Perhaps she believed herself beyond consequence. Either way, the trap was closing. The walls of Čachtice Castle, once her shield, were about to become her prison. By December of 1610, Thurso was ready. He had gathered enough testimony, enough whispers, enough blood-soaked fragments of truth. With the king's warrant in hand and soldiers at his back, he rode toward Čachtice to confront the woman whose cruelty had echoed across the land. What he would find there would haunt him in all of Europe for centuries. On the cold dawn of December 29th, 1610, the silence surrounding Čachtice Castle was broken by the sound of hooves and steel. Palatine Gheorghe Thurso arrived with soldiers carrying a royal warrant. The mist hung low over the hills, and the villagers, still asleep in their cottages, would later remember hearing the distant thunder of boots echoing against the stone walls. Thurso had planned carefully. He wanted the element of surprise. The soldiers advanced through the fortress gates before servants could scatter or evidence be destroyed. What greeted them was not merely suspicion confirmed, it was horror unveiled. The first thing that struck the men was the stench. It was the unmistakable odor of death, thick and cloying, pressing against their lungs. Several soldiers gagged, some stepped back into the winter air to recover. But the Palatine urged them forward. The smell was a guide, leading them deeper into the castle's bowels. In one chamber, they found two young women, barely alive, their bodies ravaged by torture. One was so recently beaten that her wounds still bled. Another, lifeless, lay discarded as though she had been no more than refuse. The soldiers, hardened men who had seen war, were shaken. In another room, they discovered partially dismembered remains, limbs arranged in patterns that suggested more than cruelty, perhaps ritual. Basins of congealed blood stood in corners, and tools of torture, irons, pincers, knives were scattered as if hastily abandoned. But the most dreadful sight awaited in Elizabeth's private chambers. There, they found a great silver tub filled with liquid dark and steaming. The color left no doubt. It was blood. Floating within were strands of hair and small, pale fragments of flesh. On the floor nearby lay another girl, newly slain, her blood clearly drained into the bath. And there was Elizabeth herself. Accounts differ. Some say she was found in the act of overseeing a torture, others that she stood by the basin, her dress spattered with red. But all agree that she was calm, even defiant. To the soldiers, she was less a noble woman than a specter, her pale face lit by candlelight, framed in the steam rising from her grisly ritual. Among the evidence was a small, leather-bound book, Elizabeth's personal diary. In it, investigators claimed to have found lists of names, numbers, and disturbing descriptions of her experiments. Some said the entries totaled over 600 victims. Others believed those numbers were exaggerated by later retellings. Yet even the smallest fraction of what was recorded was monstrous beyond imagination. The soldiers led her away, but the castle itself remained behind as testimony. Its walls dripped with the echoes of what they had seen. Torture chambers disguised as storerooms, hidden doors leading to pits, stones that would never again be free of the stains they had absorbed. For Thurso and his men, the raid was not simply the capture of a criminal, it was a descent into a nightmare. And though Elizabeth was now under arrest, her crimes had already begun their transformation into legend. Elizabeth Báthory herself would never face a courtroom. Her rank as a countess placed her beyond the reach of ordinary justice, and King Matthias, wary of setting a precedent by executing nobility, allowed her punishment to take a different form. But her accomplices, the ones who had lured, restrained, tortured, and disposed of bodies, were not so fortunate. In early 1611, the trials of Dorothea Sentes, János Újvári, Ilona Jo, and Catalin Bennek began. Europe had seen witch trials and heresy trials before, but this was something different. A public unmasking of systematic murder that chilled even seasoned judges. The court heard testimony from peasants, former servants, and officials. Witness after witness spoke of missing daughters, of screams in the night, of bribes given to silence suspicion. Survivors described punishments that had crossed the line into torment, beatings that lasted for hours, flesh burned by irons, fingernails torn away, bodies drained of blood into bowls placed beneath them. The evidence was overwhelming. Investigators presented items taken from Čachtice: torture devices, blood-stained garments, fragments of bone buried shallowly in castle grounds. But the most damning testimonies came not from the victims' families, but from the accomplices themselves. Faced with the certainty of death, each turned on the others, weaving a tapestry of horror in which Elizabeth was always the central figure. Dorothea, the so-called witch, claimed she had only obeyed orders, yet witnesses described her as an eager participant who devised new methods of pain. Janos, the dwarf who served as executioner, admitted to killing with his own hands but insisted fear had driven him. Ilona, who had once been a servant girl herself, confessed to luring others to their deaths. Catalin, the washerwoman, described scrubbing away stains while pretending not to hear the screams that echoed above. The public devoured the proceedings. Pamphlets circulated across Hungary and beyond, describing the monstrous acts of the Blood Countess and her circle. In an age fascinated by tales of witches, demons, and the devil's work, the trial fit neatly into Europe's hunger for stories of evil. Some even wondered if Elizabeth had made a pact with dark forces, and her servants were seen as willing conspirators in her infernal bargain. The verdicts were inevitable. All four were found guilty of aiding in mass murder. Their sentences reflected not only punishment, but spectacle. Dorothea and Ilona were burned alive. Janos was beheaded before his body was consigned to the flames, and Catalin, considered the least culpable, was imprisoned for life. Elizabeth's name was spoken often in the trial, yet she herself was absent, confined in her castle. To the public, this absence was proof of the corrupt protections of nobility. To the crown, it was a necessary compromise. But as the flames consumed her servants, Elizabeth's reputation burned alongside them. The image of the Blood Countess was now fixed in the imagination of Europe, not as rumor, but as fact sworn under oath. Although the trial of her accomplices had shocked Europe, Elizabeth herself never entered the courtroom. To put a countess of such standing on trial would have shaken the foundations of Hungary's aristocracy. Executing her was unthinkable, for it might set a precedent dangerous to every noble family. And yet, releasing her was impossible. The crimes were too many, too grotesque, too widely known. So a compromise was reached, a punishment both symbolic and cruel. Elizabeth Báthory would be imprisoned within the very castle where she had committed her atrocities. But not in chains, nor in a dungeon. Instead, she was condemned to a living tomb. In late 1611, Masons arrived at Čachtice Castle with orders to seal her inside her own tower. They walled up the doorways with stone and mortar, leaving only small openings through which food could be passed and waste removed. The windows were barred and shuttered, cutting her off from the outside world. Elizabeth, who had once commanded dozens of servants and ruled vast estates, was reduced to 3 rooms: a bedchamber, a small sitting room, and a prayer chamber. At first, she raged. Guards reported her screaming for hours, insisting that her noble blood would protect her, that the king had no right to confine her. She threatened her captors with vengeance when she was freed, as though convinced this punishment was only temporary. But as weeks stretched into months, the defiance turned to pleading. She begged her guards to carry messages, to let her see her children, to grant her sunlight. None of her requests were answered. Over time, rage and despair curdled into something stranger. Guards began to whisper of voices heard from her rooms when no one was present. Elizabeth talked for hours to unseen companions, sometimes murmuring like a child, sometimes shouting as though arguing with ghosts. She claimed that the spirits of her victims appeared to her, young girls standing at her bedside, their pale forms dripping blood, whispering in languages she could not understand. The Countess, who had once tried to cheat time, now became its prisoner. Her famous beauty withered in the stale air. Deprived of sunlight, her skin grew waxen and sickly. Her hair thinned, her posture bent, her hands, once adorned with rings, trembled with age. The mirror, the object of her obsession, became a torment. Guards said she stared into it for hours, transfixed not by vanity but by horror, as she watched her face decay day by day. There was a bitter irony in her fate. Elizabeth had spent years bathing in blood, convinced she could defy mortality. Now she aged in solitude, with no audience to admire her, no victims to prolong her illusion, no servants to echo her power. She had sought eternal youth and glory, but what she received was the slow, inescapable march of time, played out in silence, behind stone walls. The punishment was not swift, nor merciful. It was designed to mirror her own cruelty, a slow wasting, a drawn-out torment, a life lived in a prison of her own making. And for nearly 4 years, Elizabeth Báthory endured it, until death, at last, claimed the woman who had tried so desperately to master it. On the morning of August 21st, 1614, the guards of Čachtice Tower arrived with Elizabeth Báthory's meager meal. They found her lying motionless on her bed. She was 54 years old. Official reports described her death as peaceful, the final sleep of a woman who had once fought furiously against time, but had finally surrendered to it. Some whispered suicide, others suspected slow poison, but the truth was simpler. Elizabeth had been defeated by the same enemy she tried to outwit: mortality. Her death brought little mourning. To many, it was a relief, a closing of a wound that had festered in the heart of Hungary for years. Yet her burial was far from simple. At first, she was interred in the local church at Čachtice, but the villagers protested violently. They claimed her presence defiled sacred ground, that her body carried the weight of curses and sin too great to rest among the innocent. The church relented, and her remains were moved in secrecy to the Báthory family crypt in Exod, far to the east. Her grave was left unmarked, deliberately hidden, so that no pilgrim, whether of curiosity or devotion, could ever stand before it. The castle itself quickly fell into ruin. Servants fled, unwilling to remain in walls where so many had screamed and bled. Locals avoided the fortress, whispering that it was haunted by the ghosts of Elizabeth's victims. Travelers passing through the region reported strange lights flickering in the abandoned towers, voices echoing through empty halls, and sudden chills in rooms where no one had walked for years. In the decades that followed, her story began to spread across Europe. Some accounts focused on the cold facts, the testimonies, the number of bodies, the details of her trial, but others grew more elaborate, weaving in superstition and horror. Within a generation, Elizabeth Báthory was no longer simply a noblewoman turned killer. She had become legend, a figure of almost supernatural evil, a woman who bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her youth. Her name left a scar on Hungary's history, but it also gave rise to myth. In taverns and courts alike, she was compared to witches, demons, even to the undead. Some claimed she was the first female vampire, her crimes inspiring stories that would echo centuries later in Gothic literature. To those who feared her memory, the ruins of Čachtice were cursed ground. To those drawn to the macabre, they became a place of dark fascination. Thus, in death, Elizabeth achieved a kind of immortality, not the eternal youth she had sought in blood, but a permanence far stranger. She became inseparable from the castle, a spirit bound to stone, her legacy preserved not in beauty, but in terror. The story of Elizabeth Báthory did not end with her burial. In some ways, her death was only the beginning. For while her body was hidden, her legend escaped the crypt. Within a few short decades, Whispers of her cruelty spread far beyond Hungary's borders, reshaped with every retelling until fact and folklore were indistinguishable. Chroniclers recorded testimony that she had killed dozens, perhaps hundreds, of girls. Some witnesses claimed 80, others spoke of 200, while still others insisted on more than 600 victims. The numbers swelled with time, each generation adding weight to the horror. What began as rumor hardened into a myth of almost supernatural scope. A.D. Writers in Vienna and Krakow, Prague and beyond, began to retell the tale in pamphlets and chronicles, each version darker than the last. Soon she was no longer merely a noblewoman with a taste for cruelty, but a monster who bathed in the blood of virgins to preserve her beauty. The image was vivid, terrifying, irresistible, and it spread like wildfire across Europe. In this way, Elizabeth Báthory became something more than a historical figure. She became a cultural archetype. Gothic writers of later centuries would draw on her legend when crafting the female vampire. Beautiful, aristocratic, eternally young, but feeding on the lives of the innocent. From Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla to Bram Stoker's Dracula, the shadow of the Blood Countess lingers in the background. Folklore also transformed her into a symbol of feminine corruption. In an age when women were expected to be chaste, nurturing, and obedient, Elizabeth's story became a warning of what could happen when female power went unchecked. Her sexuality and cruelty were exaggerated until she was less a woman than an embodiment of sin itself. Part seductress, part demon, part witch. And yet, buried within the myth remains the historical Elizabeth, a widow, a noblewoman, a product of a violent age who wielded power in ways that horrified her contemporaries. The myth made her eternal, but it also obscured the truth. What we remember most today, the infamous bloodbaths, may be less historical fact than legend carefully cultivated by enemies, storytellers, and time itself. Still, whether truth or invention, the image was too powerful to fade. The Countess became immortal, not through blood, but through story. Her beauty crumbled in life, but in death, she was transformed into a dark icon who has haunted Europe for more than 4 centuries. For centuries, Elizabeth Báthory's name has been remembered, but the names of her victims have faded into silence. History has preserved the monster. It has nearly erased those who suffered beneath her. Yet to understand the true weight of her crimes, we must remember that they were not faceless girls in a legend, but living, breathing human beings with families, hopes, and futures of their own. Most of the victims were servant girls, aged 14 to 20. They came from nearby villages, drawn to the castle by promises of work. For their families, sending a daughter to Čachtice seemed a chance for stability, a position that might help feed younger siblings, or allow the girl to learn skills that would one day help her marry. Instead, they found themselves caught in a nightmare where the very lady who should have protected them became their executioner. A few names survive in court records. Anna, who was torn apart by dogs after days of torture. Kata, whose flesh was burned with irons until her body gave way. Pola, beaten so savagely with clubs that her cries echoed across the courtyard. Each of these girls lived a life cut short not by accident or war, but by the vanity of a woman who believed their youth was hers to consume. Even noble-born victims, though fewer, shared the same fate. They were sent by parents who trusted the Countess's reputation, expecting refinement and protection. Instead, they found themselves locked in stone rooms, stripped of dignity, their cries stifled by thick walls. For their families, the loss was unbearable, not only grief, but shame. To have entrusted their daughters to Elizabeth and receive silence in return was a betrayal that would haunt generations. The survivors bore scars of their own. Some escaped, but could never shake the memories of screams in the night, of blood pooling beneath stone, of companions dragged away and never seen again. Villagers carried the burden of silence, living in the shadow of a fortress they could neither challenge nor flee. The very air around Čachtice seemed poisoned with fear. Too often, history records the deeds of rulers while forgetting those who suffered under them. But here, perhaps more than anywhere, it is essential to remember, Elizabeth's legend was built not on her own power, but on the stolen lives of hundreds of young women. They were the foundation of her myth, the unseen voices that gave weight to the horror. Without them, there would be no Blood Countess. Each scream silenced, each life extinguished, was a story cut short. A daughter who never returned home. A sister whose absence left families broken. A friend whose name faded into rumor. The true tragedy of Elizabeth Báthory is not that she became infamous, but that her victims became forgotten. When historians look back on Elizabeth Báthory, they often struggle to separate myth from reality. But even stripped of legend, the picture that emerges is chilling, not merely of a cruel woman, but of a psyche warped by power, vanity, and madness. Modern psychology gives us terms that her contemporaries lacked. Her inability to feel empathy, her willingness to inflict suffering for pleasure, her grandiose sense of entitlement, all suggest psychopathy. Her obsession with youth and appearance veered into the territory of delusion, the kind of obsessive disorder that blinds reason. The Báthory bloodline itself may have been a factor. Centuries of intermarriage within noble families concentrated wealth, but also inherited instability. Madness, paranoia, and violent temper haunted her relatives, and Elizabeth may have been their most extreme heir. Yet Elizabeth was not shaped by blood alone. She was also the product of a society where cruelty was not only permitted, but often celebrated. The feudal system granted nobles near absolute authority over peasants. They could imprison, mutilate, or even kill those beneath them with little fear of consequence. Elizabeth's killings were horrific, but they did not occur in isolation. They were enabled by a structure that devalued human life according to class. For years, her crimes went unchecked, not because they were invisible, but because they were committed against those the system considered disposable. Her accomplices, too, reveal another dimension: complicity. Elizabeth did not kill alone. She required others to obey, to fetch victims, to restrain, to dispose of bodies. Some may have acted out of fear, others out of greed, still others out of their own cruelty. Their silence prolonged the nightmare. In this sense, Elizabeth's reign of terror was not merely the act of one woman, but a collective failure. Proof of how easily ordinary people can become agents of atrocity when commanded by power. If Elizabeth had lived today, she might have been studied as one of history's most prolific serial killers. She shared the same psychological traits that criminologists identify in modern murderers: control, manipulation, obsession, and a chilling ability to maintain a respectable public face while committing unspeakable acts in private. The difference was not in her nature, but in her environment. Unlike modern killers, she was shielded by privilege. Her castle walls, her family name, her wealth all conspired to protect her until her crimes finally touched the noble class. In this sense, Elizabeth Báthory's story is not just about personal evil. It is about the way power amplifies madness. Given wealth, immunity, and silence, her cruelty became limitless. Her legend horrifies us not only because of what she did, but because it shows how thin the line is between civilization and savagery when power is left unchecked. Elizabeth Báthory's obsession may seem grotesque, even alien to us today. The image of a countess bathing in blood to preserve her beauty feels like something pulled from a nightmare rather than history. Yet beneath the horror lies something disturbingly familiar: the human fear of aging, the relentless desire to hold on to youth, whatever the cost. In the early 17th century, this fear was everywhere. Alchemists whispered of the elixir vitae, the water of life that could restore youth. Philosophers wrote of mystical fountains, and physicians experimented with strange tonics, herb, and rituals. Even monarchs sought cures for mortality. Emperors drank mercury in the hope of immortality. Queens covered their faces with poisonous powders to maintain pale skin. Elizabeth's belief that youth could be stolen from others was extreme, but it was not born in a vacuum. It was nurtured by a culture already obsessed with defying time. What makes her story haunting is how little that obsession has changed. Today, we no longer seek youth in bowls of blood, but in needles, surgeries, and endless cosmetic industries. Billions are spent each year on creams promising to erase wrinkles, on injections that freeze the passage of time, on procedures that sculpt and tighten as though age itself were an enemy to be conquered. Elizabeth's madness is reflected back at us in subtler forms. We may recoil from her rituals, but do we not live in a world where appearance often outweighs substance, where youth is idolized and age treated as decline? Her desperate struggle against the mirror feels like a darker echo of struggles many still face, though few would ever dare take it to such monstrous extremes. Elizabeth believed beauty equaled power, and that to lose one was to lose the other. In this, she was not wrong. Even in our world, where women in positions of influence are still judged more harshly for age than for ability, the link between appearance and authority remains potent. Her obsession was not just vanity, it was survival within a society that equated a woman's worth with her youth. And so, the legend of the Blood Countess endures not only as horror, but as caution. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. How far would we go to defy the passage of time? How much suffering would we ignore or cause just to keep hold of beauty for a little longer? Centuries have passed since Elizabeth Báthory drew her last breath, yet her shadow has never faded. The ruins of Čachtice Castle still rise above the hills of Slovakia, their broken towers like jagged teeth biting into the sky. Travelers who climb the path to the fortress describe a silence that feels heavier than mere absence of sound. The stones seem to remember. On certain nights, locals whisper, when the wind coils through the valleys, faint cries still drift from the broken windows, echoes of the girls who never left. Elizabeth sought immortality through blood, but in truth she achieved it through fear. Her story has outlived her body, her castles, even her dynasty. She is remembered not as the noblewoman who managed vast estates, nor as the widow of a famed soldier, but as the Blood Countess, a figure who embodies humanity's darkest capacity for cruelty. Her tale lingers because it unsettles us. It is more than a story of a single woman's madness. It is a mirror held up to power unchecked, to silence enforced by fear, to the ease with which societies dismiss the suffering of the powerless until it touches their own. Elizabeth's crimes might feel distant, locked in the dungeons of another age, yet the questions they raise are eternal. How far will people go to preserve beauty? How long will power protect the guilty? And how many remain silent while the innocent suffer? In this sense, the echoes of the Blood Countess are not only screams from the past, they are warnings for the present. Every ruined stone of Čachtice is a reminder that cruelty thrives when power is absolute and compassion is absent. Elizabeth achieved a kind of immortality, but not the one she sought. Instead of eternal youth, she is remembered as a cautionary tale, her name written not in beauty, but in blood. In the end, Elizabeth Báthory did not find the secret to eternal youth. The blood dried, the screams faded, and the woman who once believed herself untouchable died alone, walled into her own castle. 4 centuries later, her name endures, but not as she hoped. Not for beauty, nor power, nor nobility. She is remembered as a monster, a warning, a story whispered to remind us what happens when cruelty goes unchecked. Yet perhaps the most haunting part of her legacy is not her own fate, but the silence of those she destroyed. Each victim was a daughter, a sister, a friend, whose life was cut short before it could bloom. They remain nameless shadows in her story, their voices lost, their dreams erased. If Elizabeth achieved a kind of immortality, it was purchased at the cost of their forgotten lives. And so her tale forces us to look not only backward, but inward. For history's monsters are never just creatures of the past. They are reflections of what power, vanity, and fear can awaken in any age. Elizabeth's mirror did not only show her face, it shows ours as well. The ruins of Čachtice still stand, crumbling but defiant. Some say that when the wind is right, you can hear faint cries in the night. But perhaps what we should really listen for are not the echoes of the dead, but the quieter voices within ourselves, the warnings against cruelty, the call for compassion, the reminder that beauty fades, but what we do to others endures. Elizabeth Báthory sought to cheat death and became eternal in a way she never imagined. Her immortality is carved not in marble or memory of greatness, but in fear, in blood, and in legend. And in that legend lies a lesson. True power is not found in taking life to preserve our own, but in valuing life enough to let it flourish. Her story has ended, but the questions it raises remain.